What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to take a look at some fights that happened June 4th, 1908, September 7th, 1908, and November 26th, 1908. It happened between two dynamic middleweight champions, Billy Babke, who they call the Illinois Thunderbolt, and Stanley Ketchel, the Michigan Assassin. Phenomenal fights. And I want to take a look at them right here with you on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Now, Stanley Ketchel was born September 14th, 1886 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He died October 15th, 1910. He was 24 years of age at the time of his death. Now, his hometown was Buddy, Montana. He stood 5'9" and had total bouts of 58, 49 wins, 5 losses, 46 knockouts, 3 draws, and he was stopped himself 3 separate times. Now, like I said, he was from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was a Polish immigrant. He ran away from his home at the age of 12. And he wound up getting a job as a bellhop. He was a very strong young man, so he was hired as a bouncer several times. But after the age of 16, he began professional boxing. And in between boxing, he would have well over 150 street fights, barroom brawls. He would break up fights. He was just an all-around strong kid that had a temper and believed that no one was stronger than he was. Now, the thing with Stanley Ketchel is always myth on how he was shot and killed. Now, he was killed October 10th, 1910, by Walter Dipley. Now, Walter Dipley owned a huge farm. He had a girlfriend by the name of Goldie Smith. And Stanley Ketchel had this mystique. And he was well known wherever he went. And he was admired by many women. But Goldie Smith allegedly propositioned Stanley Ketchel. She admired him. And she offered some services to him. And Walter Dipley would find out about it. And with a gauge shotgun, he would end Stanley Ketchel's life. And what's ironic about the Ketchel family, Stanley Ketchel, his father named Thomas, was found February 16th, 1928, with his throat slashed, multiple lacerations. And his younger brother, John, was caught with a bloody knife. And he was caught and sentenced. Now, Walter Dipley was sentenced for life in prison. And younger brother John would just do a few years. But what's amazing about this entire story is that Stanley Ketchel, who was in the most brutal sport in the world, would be killed from a flirtatious circumstance of a young lady, Goldie Smith. Fascinating. Thomas Ketchel was 74 years of age at the time of his death. Quite a remarkable story. Now, Stanley Ketchel would be the only fighter that I can think of would fight more fighters with the name Kid. He fought Kid Leroy, Jim Kid McGuire, Kid Lee, 2 separate occasions. He won one and lost one. Kid Foley defeated him twice. Kid Thomas, Kid Pector, Kid Frederick defeated him. And Maryville's Kid. Fascinating. Stanley Ketchel. Now, Stanley Ketchel would also fight fighters such as Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He would defeat him. Montana Jack Sullivan. He would defeat him. Mike Twin Sullivan. Defeat him. Jack Twin Sullivan. Knocked him out in 1 round. Matter of a few seconds. He went down 3 separate times and just couldn't get up the 3rd time. The Jack Twin Sullivan. Now, Jack Twin Sullivan and Mike Twin Sullivan were twin brothers. And they looked very close in similarity. And they would sometimes fight each other's fight for one another. Stanley Ketchel would also face Joe Thomas. Fought him 4 times. Defeated him 3 times and lost to him, or had a draw to him once. So he would have 3 wins and 1 draw. And I got to tell you that Joe Thomas fight was a very, very good fight. The first fight they fought. He would face Jack Johnson, October 16th, 1909. Jack Johnson had a fighting record at that time at 51-5-10. 23 knockouts. Stanley Ketchel would have a fighting record of 48-4-3 with 43 knockouts. Now, this fight was supposed to be somewhat of a stage fight. They were trying to get promotional rights. Just a little bit of a build-up. Both guys would get paid, and they would go home. It was for movie rights. But Stanley Ketchel would deviate from the script. And he would launch an overhand right to the jaw of Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson would get up immediately, dust off about a half a dozen teeth off his glove. And he would walk right over to Stanley Ketchel. And he would bang him so hard that it would flatten him crucifixion style. Stanley Ketchel would just lay there for minutes upon minutes. Didn't know where he was. He looked like a part of the canvas. But that's Stanley Ketchel for you. He would also face Sam Langford. Sam Langford I have ranked number 1 as the greatest fighter of all times. I have Jack Johnson ranked number 5 of all times. But Sam Langford would come in that fight with a fighting record of 68-7-22. They fought at National AC Philadelphia. And Sam Langford would defeat Stanley Ketchel. But Ketchel had in his contract that the belt would never be on the line against a black fighter. Sam Langford was promised a second opportunity. It would never happen in 1910 because at that point, Stanley Ketchel would be shot by Walter Dipley. Stanley Ketchel would also face Frank Klaus. Porky Dan Flynn fought him twice. Willie Lewis. Willie Lewis had a fighting record coming in at 74-11-9. And he would knock out Willie Lewis. Willie Lewis was a fascinating fighter. I'm going to show you Willie Lewis a little later in this video. Billy Papke, the Illinois Thunderbolt. His name was William H. Papke. He was born September 17, 1886, Spring Valley, Illinois. He died November 26, 1936. He was 50 years of age at the time of his death. He stood 5'9". He had total fights of 54, 37 wins, 31 knockouts, 11 losses. He was stopped 1 time himself by Ketchel. And he had a 6-round draw. Now in 1906, he would face several fighters that year. But Billy began fighting and winning 23 and drawing 4 times. And he was a vicious puncher. His first loss to Stanley Ketchel. Like I said, Stanley Ketchel was a vicious body puncher and a tremendous banger. He punched almost like a light heavyweight. Billy Papke defeats Stanley Ketchel for the middleweight championship belt in his second fight. Now, rumors were that Stanley Ketchel sucker punched Billy Papke in the throat while referee Jim Jeffries' instructions were being told to him. Now, those are rumors. I understand there are articles to support that claim. I've spoken to many old-time fighters, and they all get the same story. They heard this and they heard that, but that's what we're going with right now in this conversation. Billy Papke would lose the third fight. He would suffer a beating that was unrecognizable to his own wife. Stanley Ketchel wouldn't waste any time throwing haymakers, overhand lefts, and overhand rights. You see, Stanley Ketchel was the maker of somewhat of a corkscrew punch that was invented by Kid McCoy. But he had what is called a shuffle, where he would switch to southpaw in the middle of a punch. And he would throw another punch and switch back to orthodox. He would face Hugo Kelly 4 separate occasions. Fireman Jim Flynn. Jim Flynn fought 3 times with Sam Langford. He knocked out Jack Dempsey. He was in a ring with Jack Johnson, and he'd be disqualified for repeatedly headbutting Jack Johnson. But Jim Flynn was in there with everyone. Billy Papke was in there with Willie Lewis, fought him twice, as did Jack Dempsey and Stanley Ketchel. Dave Smith, Bob Mohart, these are all outstanding fighters. Frank Klaus became middleweight champion of the world. As a matter of fact, he was champion after Billy Papke, and he would lose that title to George Chip. Sella Berkey, Leo Florian Hook, Soldier Barfield, Jimmy Darcy. Just an example of the quality of fighters that Billy Papke would fight. So I got to tell you, Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke, some fight series. 2 of the great fighters of that time. Until this day, Stanley Ketchel is recognized as having the hardest punch in the middleweight division. Now, you had hard punches in that division, but for his time, he was a phenomenal puncher. To knock down Jack Johnson the way he did, to knock out the fighters in how he did it, is outstanding. Now, he wasn't the greatest responsible defensive fighter in the world, but he can punch. And since then, you had great fighters such as Ray Robinson, who revolutionized the game with quadruple left hooks, right hands, beautiful jabs, uppercuts. You had fighters such as Tony Zale, who threw dynamic body punches and came back with a second punch. You have phenomenal fighters such as Freddie Steele from Tacoma, Washington, who could punch to the body like nobody's business. You have Bernard Hopkins, the executioner. You have Roy Jones. Outstanding fighters that come after him. Marvelous Marvin Hagler, perhaps the best. He could switch left-handed, right-handed, body punch, and straight punches with either hand. Yet Emil Griffith, Dick Tiger, Carlos Monzon. Outstanding middleweights. But Stanley Ketchel was a force to be reckoned with. Coco Kid, Charlie Burley, Holman Williams. Dynamic middleweights. But Harry Smith, I still have him ranked number 4, greatest middleweight. He was a colored middleweight champion. He didn't get his opportunity. Jack McVeigh. All the great fighters in the past. Salute to the middleweights. Salute to Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke. Historically, one of the greatest middleweight fight series in boxing history. I'm going to quickly show you a few of the opponents. Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke. Philadelphia, Jack O'Brien and Frank Klaus. Jack O'Brien was a light heavyweight champion. Frank Klaus was a middleweight champion. George Carpentier, light heavyweight champion of the world. He would lose his title to Battling Siki. Jimmy Clavey, outstanding middleweight. Now, how would these men have done against Carl Bobo Olsen, who was from Hawaii, middleweight champion of the world, 1953, when he defeated Randolph Turpin. Amazing. Al Hastak. Now, Al Hastak was in there with Tony Zale. And Tony Zale would win the NBA middleweight championship of the world. Amazing. Jake LaMotta. He would defeat Marcel Cerdan in 1949 for the middleweight championship strap, and then he would lose it in 1951 to the great Sugar Ray Robinson. He would face Rob Robinson 6 different occasions. He would defeat him in 1943, but 6 weeks later, he would lose his championship. 3 weeks later to Sugar Ray Robinson. Rocky Graziano would have a 3-fight series with Tony Zale. And he would knock out Tony Zale in the 6th round. And he would become the middleweight champion of the world. Fascinating fighters with these 2 middleweights. Rocky Graziano and Jake LaMotta. How would they have done with Billy Papke and Stanley Ketchel? Mickey Walker, the Toy Bulldog, welterweight, the middleweight champion of the world. Sugar Ray Robinson, 2 outstanding middleweight champions. How would they have done against Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke? Billy Seuss and Ken Overland. How would they have done between Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke? Amazing. Tony Zale and Freddie Steele. Those would have been some fights. Well, this is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series, saying all great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Thanks for hanging in with me to revisit the Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke fight. Salute to all my subscribers. Salute to these phenomenal fighters. Peace.